Welcome to the Sandwich Lease Option module. The information in this module is part of the financing course and builds upon the information provided in the lease option introduction lesson. As such, you should have a functional understanding of lease options and their various contracts. Sandwich lease options are another, more specific aspect of making money using the general lease option technique. The identifying aspect of a sandwich lease option is that you use this technique to both enter and exit a deal. It is, essentially, putting two traditional lease options together to make money from one property. Therefore, sandwich leases have the same core elements of regular lease options, they incorporate the same marketing techniques, and the same seller, buyer, and property profiles. The main goal of this lesson is to help you understand how to evaluate each deal and determine how to structure it in order to maximize your profit. What you should know. Before beginning this guide, you should understand the following: basic principles and terminology used in real estate investing. Which properties to look for and why. Where to buy real estate. How to locate motivated sellers. How to do income property analysis. Basics of lease options. What you will learn. This guide meets the following learning objectives. Understand sandwich lease options. Identify liabilities issues related to sandwich lease options. Understand the mechanics of a sandwich lease option contract. Understand how to protect you and your sandwich lease option. Tips for success. Anytime you enter into a real estate transaction, you should know how you are going to exit that transaction. You need to have a plan in place ahead of time. This is one of the reasons having a buyer's list is so important to success when working with various lease options. Other reasons having a buyer's list is important when working with lease options include knowing what your buyer wants and when they want it so you can structure the deal around those wants. Screening buyers lets you know their down payment and monthly payment abilities. Having a clear understanding with the buyer makes negotiating with the seller easier since you know exactly how much you can give. Introduction to sandwich lease options. A sandwich lease option is technically defined as a lease held by a lessee, also called a tenant buyer, who becomes a lessor, or landlord, by way of subletting a property. Thus, the sandwich leaseholder is not the owner, nor the occupant of the property, but a middleman who sets everything up and makes a profit from the lease and eventual sale of the property. There are two separate sets of contracts in a completed sandwich lease option deal. One between the investor and property owner that gives control of the property, but not ownership, to the investor, and one between the investor and the end tenant buyer that in turn gives the tenant buyer control of the property without conceding full ownership. So what does it mean to control a property? When you control a home, you have complete control over every aspect of the home, but your name is not on the deed. That means you can live in the home, rent it, make improvements to it, and make additions to it. Lease options give the leaseholder control of a property, so you can see how beneficial they can be for investors. Go through the following hypothetical situation to understand more about how sandwich lease options work, and how they give the leaseholder control of a property without ownership. Assume you are the investor in this situation and you find a home seller, Sally, and through negotiation reach a deal where you take control of her property, though a lease option. As part of the deal, you pay Sally a down payment of $1,700, $700 first month rent and $1,000 option consideration, agree to $700 a month rent with $250 given in rent credit and a purchase price of $75,000 after the lease term of 1 year. Once that agreement is in place, you place an ad in your local newspaper that says rent to own. No bank qualifying. $3,800 down, $800 per month. The next day you get a call from Bob who, while he can't get a loan for one reason or another, is interested in your property and terms. He looks at the property and asks what terms you are asking. You tell him that all he needs is a down payment of $3,800, $800 first month rent and $3,000 as an option consideration, $800 a month in rent with $100 of that being given as rent credit, and a sales price of $89,000 after 10 months. Bob evaluates the terms and likes them, so you create a lease option agreement with him. You have created a sandwich lease transaction. To add to your enjoyment, you decide to calculate your profit from this deal. You made $2,100 up front, $1,000 in monthly rental payments and $13,800 in profit from the end sale of the property for a total net profit of $17,000. All that in just a 10-month period. Now imagine doing just one of those per month. You made $17,000 in just 10 months only using $1,700 to start. That is pretty amazing. Also take into consideration that the only thing you risked was the small cash out of pocket and the possibility that it might take a full month to find a quality tenant buyer. However, if you had created a cash flow buyers list prior to setting up the agreement with Sally, even this would not be a concern. Hopefully this example illustrates the many benefits of sandwich lease options and the importance of having a buyer's list. Another example. Michael's first real estate investment was a sandwich lease option. He wasn't entirely clear on all the details, but he went for it and it turned out to be quite a good experience for him. He saw a townhouse with a sign on it advertising that it was for sale or rent and that had an out-of-state phone number listed on it. He called the number listed and asked if they would consider doing a lease option on the property that he could in turn lease to someone else. The seller agreed, and through a series of communications, the details were worked out. The asking price on the townhouse was $95,000, but Michael negotiated a price of $91,000 in 3 years or sooner if it sold. Michael paid the agreed-upon $3,000 as an option consideration and took control of the property. He did a little painting and cleaning and then entered a lease option agreement with a tenant buyer shortly thereafter. The rent was always paid on time, and Michael took from that the amount he had agreed to pay the seller as rent and sent it on, always on time, and kept the rest, only about $50. After 9 months of receiving rent, Michael got a call from his tenant buyer and she told him that she would not be able to buy the property and that because of financial problems, she would have to move to something cheaper. Michael released her from her lease agreement with no penalties, but kept the consideration money as previously agreed. Michael then started looking for another tenant buyer. This time he put up 2 different signs, one that advertised the property for rent, and one that advertised it for sale. He found someone who was interested in renting it, and also someone interested in buying it. So, he exercised his option to purchase the property from the original owner and then sold it to the new buyer who was also an investor. Michael mentioned that he had a guy interested in renting it and got the potential renter and new owner connected. The closing attorney in charge of transferring ownership required that all relevant parties be present. Most closing costs were paid by the original seller and end buyer. Michael walked away from the closing table with $12,000 in his pocket. Advantages and challenges of sandwich lease options. As you may imagine from the examples previously given, sandwich lease options have many advantages associated with them. However, there are also some challenges you need to be aware of. This section will address both so that you can be aware of what to watch out for when you learn about sandwich lease option contracts later in this module. Advantages. In the lease option lesson you learned many of the advantages that come with traditional lease options. Well, sandwich lease options hold those same benefits as well as several that specifically apply to sandwich deals. One of the main benefits, especially to the beginning investor, is that you can get into a sandwich lease option regardless of your personal income or credit history. That makes even the most common excuse for not getting involved in real estate, "I don't have any money and can't get a loan," moot. Another huge benefit to a sandwich lease is if your tenant buyer doesn't pay, you have the right to evict them. That way, you don't have to go through the headache and trouble of foreclosing on them, and you don't need permission to do so from the owner. In addition, you are not responsible for the mortgage on the property, only your lease agreement. So in a worst-case scenario something happens and you can't make the monthly payments, your credit is not damaged by a foreclosure, you just get evicted from the property and can then move on to another. Landlord-seller advantages. In addition to the general advantages just given, there are other advantages specific to the landlord-seller. One of the most obvious and important is that by offering a lease option you will be able to ask for and get closer to your asking price and higher than average monthly rent. You can demand this because you are offering a great value and attractive financing to help the tenant buyer. Another monetary benefit as the landlord-seller is the receipt of the non-refundable option consideration. The amount required can typically be as much or as little as you wish. You should check your local state laws to make sure they have not enacted legislation that puts a cap on how much can be required, but for the most part it can be what you wish. As landlord-seller you also have peace of mind in a variety of ways. First is that you can demand top sales price, even if demand is low, but as a close second you can demand higher than normal rent and thus a higher monthly cash flow. You don't have the headaches of maintenance the way a traditional landlord does, because your tenants have a vested interest in the property. As a result, you can typically expect higher quality tenants who will not only care for the home, but be there to protect it from vandalism, theft, and fire. Other benefits as landlord in a sandwich lease option are that you won't have to worry about realtor fees and more than likely closing costs. You will have such a large percentage of the available market interested in your property that there is no need for an agent, and since you are the middleman in the purchase, many times you can negotiate that the original owner and the end buyer cover the closing costs. Each of those savings taken together can save you thousands on your bottom line profit. Tenant buyer advantages. One of the best things about sandwich lease options is that while you benefit, you are also helping someone else tremendously at the same time. See, the tenant buyer gets to experience significantly faster equity growth than what they would experience using traditional financing. Similarly, they are not just throwing money away on rent. Their rent money is working for them in the form of the rent credit you offer, as is the option consideration they pay you up front on the deal. As another benefit, you are offering them home ownership with a minimum amount of money out of pocket. Traditional financing requires them to bring in a minimum of 5%, plus broker fees, and many times agent fees and closing costs. With your sandwich lease option, they don't have to worry about any of those fees. Also, because of the equity gain and little out-of-pocket expenses, the tenant buyer frequently doesn't have to come up with any more money down when they decide to exercise their option. That's because by the time they do want to buy, they already have built up 10% equity, or 10% down. That alone can be a huge relief to the buyers. Outside of monetary benefits, you also offer time to decide if they love the house and the area. They can live there and get to know neighbors before they have a big financial obligation to the property, so that if they decide they don't like the home or the area, it is easier for them to leave. They retain some of their privacy as well since their name is not on the deed or in the public records until they decide to exercise their option. Challenges. As a result, you can typically expect higher quality tenants who will not only care for the home, but be there to protect it from vandalism, theft, and fire. Other benefits as landlord in a sandwich lease option are that you won't have to worry about realtor fees and more than likely closing costs. You will have such a large percentage of the available market interested in your property that there is no need for an agent, and since you are the middleman in the purchase, many times you can negotiate that the original owner and the end buyer cover the closing costs. Each of those savings taken together can save you thousands on your bottom line profit. Tenant buyer advantages. One of the best things about sandwich lease options is that while you benefit, you are also helping someone else tremendously at the same time. See, the tenant buyer gets to experience significantly faster equity growth than what they would experience using traditional financing. Similarly, they are not just throwing money away on rent. Their rent money is working for them in the form of the rent credit you offer, as is the option consideration they pay you up front on the deal. As another benefit, you are offering them home ownership with a minimum amount of money out of pocket. Traditional financing requires them to bring in a minimum of 5%, plus broker fees, and many times agent fees and closing costs. With your sandwich lease option, they don't have to worry about any of those fees. Also, because of the equity gain and little out-of-pocket expenses, the tenant buyer frequently doesn't have to come up with any more money down when they decide to exercise their option. That's because by the time they do want to buy, they already have built up 10% equity, or 10% down. That alone can be a huge relief to the buyers. Outside of monetary benefits, you also offer time to decide if they love the house and the area. They can live there and get to know neighbors before they have a big financial obligation to the property, so that if they decide they don't like the home or the area, it is easier for them to leave. They retain some of their privacy as well, since their name is not on the deed or in the public records until they decide to exercise their option. As with anything good, sandwich lease options are not without their challenges. One of the most prominent that you may be thinking about is that when the tenant buyer is ready to exercise their option, you also have to exercise your option, because legally, you can't sell a property you don't first own, even if you end up owning it for just a few minutes. In addition to this, you should to make it very clear in your agreements who is going to be responsible for what closing costs, so as to avoid confusion or arguing at the closing table. This may not seem like much of a challenge, but there are those who will be shocked when they find out how much you are making on the deal and that there is a third party involved. Typically, there is nothing that will cause the deal to fall through, but it can create a bit of awkwardness at closing if the buyer is taken by surprise. Other challenges that arise in a sandwich lease option include what to do to make sure the first mortgage is being paid during the lease period. Recall, you don't have control over that. Paying is the original owner's responsibility. You can set up an escrow account to help make sure this payment gets made, and you will learn more about such an account a bit later in this guide. You also have to worry about the original owner not getting too involved in the day-to-day activities of the property and not letting you take care of your investment. This is not a big problem as long as the property remains in roughly the same condition, or better, as it was when you executed the lease with the seller. Potential liabilities. There are also potential liabilities when working with sandwich lease options. And while these potential liabilities are not common problems in a sandwich situation, it is important for you to know of them and how to treat them. The first potential liability is if you promise the seller that you will guarantee rent. If you consider the frequency of people who have no ethics walking away from rental agreements with no notice and no money paid, you will realize that you don't want to commit yourself to cover someone else's non-performance. Instead, have the lease set up on a performance basis, which essentially means that if you, the investor, get paid, you will in turn pay the seller. Now, you may be thinking, what person in their right mind would agree to such a deal? Well, it is the person who needs to move their property and needs to start making money from their property quickly, in other words, a motivated seller. If your seller is not motivated, it is highly unlikely they will agree to such terms. So make sure you are focusing on those sellers who are in fact motivated. When you present this idea of paying on a performance basis, you should use something similar to the following. Steve Seller, if you hired a property manager, that person won't guarantee you anything and they will collect 7 to 10% of the collected rent. What I'm going to do is, and you present your offer of a lease option agreement. The second potential liability is the underlying mortgage, or the mortgage the seller is responsible for paying. You need to examine that mortgage and determine if it is a fixed rate or a variable rate mortgage. Ideally, you don't want to work with a seller unless the mortgage is fixed, and preferably for 15 to 30 years. Now, if you come across a great deal that has a variable interest rate, you can help the seller refinance to a fixed rate and then work with them. A third potential liability is if you like the idea of sandwich lease options, but not the idea of being a landlord-seller. If you just don't want to be involved in a property for the term of the lease, then you can consider doing a cooperative assignment. A cooperative assignment is a situation where you lease option a property from a seller and then, when you find a tenant buyer, you simply assign the lease option you negotiated to the new tenant buyer for a fee. There is slightly different paperwork involved in this kind of deal, and it will be covered a bit more in the option lesson. But it is a potentiality you should be aware of when considering sandwich lease options. A final potential liability to consider is, what happens if you only have the choice of working with rather expensive properties whose underlying mortgage payments are more than can be supported by even higher than average market rents? If you face this issue, it may seem like sandwich lease options won't work for you, but that is not the case. If the underlying mortgage payment is more than the market rent can support, you could consider doing an equity split with the seller where they help cover the negative cash flow in exchange for a benefit later in the deal. When you do this, let the seller write what they would like out of the deal to help grease the wheels, so to speak. An example of splitting equity might look like this. Landlord, seller, to receive 20% of the net profit generated from the sale of the home. This profit will be calculated by taking the gross sale price less all costs. Additionally, tenant, you as the investor, and landlord agree that the home will be sold for an amount that may be more or less than area comparables. However, the lowest price the tenant, investor, will resell the house for is $XXX, for the example let's say $400,000, and if the house should sell for less than this, tenant agrees to pay landlord, under the terms of this agreement, the same amount as if it was sold for this amount. This example illustrates that the seller is guaranteed a profit of around $80,000, depending on the actual sales price. That's a good deal in exchange for the seller paying some of the negative cash flow over a year or two while the lease option is in effect. There is one other item to keep in mind, especially pertaining to an equity split scenario, and that is the agreement you make between you and the seller is between you and the seller, and the agreement you make between you and the tenant buyer is only between you and the tenant buyer. That is to say, whatever the tenant buyer does or does not do, doesn't affect the agreement between you and the seller. So if the tenant buyer simply walks away from the property without being evicted, you then become responsible for making payments to the seller until you have a new tenant buyer. So if you can't make those payments, you may, in turn, be evicted. If that happens, you will most likely lose your option consideration money and anything you have put into the property. Thus, it is very important for you to read and make certain you understand the terms of the lease agreement you sign and that your tenant buyer signs. Some include phrases that allow for a landlord to sue for unpaid rent if you leave the property without being evicted. Similarly, you should make sure to have a clause in your tenant buyer lease agreement stating that you have the right to sue for unpaid rent if the tenant buyer simply walks away without being evicted. It is a rare case when these issues will arise, but since it happens, you need to be aware of how your agreements are worded. The mechanics. If there is one investing technique that tends to arouse more skepticism than any other, it is the sandwich lease option. Some investors have a hard time adapting this strategy to what they need and see in their respective areas. However, sandwich lease options can work in virtually any market conditions if you know how to properly set them up. This section will focus on some of the things that need to be done to get a sandwich lease option to work anywhere and in any market. When you approach a seller to propose a lease option, say something like, "Mr. or Mrs. Seller, I don't know if this is a fit for you, but I may be able to solve your house problem. Do you currently have a mortgage on the property? What is your monthly payment? I can buy your property for top dollar, but I need you to rent it to me for X period of time with X down payment. Does this sound like something you would be interested in? How much do you need per month in order for you to do this?" Then, after you have said your part, listen. Because it is through listening that you learn what you need to do in order to get the property. Recall in a sandwich lease option, you use the lease option to acquire the property and then again to sell it. So pay attention to what the seller says so you know exactly how to structure the lease option to make it appeal to the seller. Then you know exactly what you need to work with the tenant buyer to be able to profit from the deal. Now, the traditional sandwich lease option consists of waiting for your tenant buyer to exercise their option. You need to ensure that your tenant buyer informs you of their intent to exercise their option with enough time for you to exercise your option on the property. This because, as you recall, you cannot legally sell a property you do not own. You can arrange everything for the sale, but you can't be the one who sells it unless you own it. However, if owning a property is a problem for you, one thing you can do is simply ensure you have a clause in your lease and option agreements that gives you the right to assign both agreements to a third party for a fee. If you do this, the person to whom you assign the agreements is now responsible for abiding by the terms and conditions of the agreements you established with the seller. Obviously, the disadvantage of this practice is that you do not benefit from the cash flow for the duration of the lease, but it is a good way to get out of a property quickly and still make some money. So even if you don't have money or the ability to exercise your side of an option in order to sell it to your tenant buyer, you can still make money with a sandwich lease option. Here is an example of how a sandwich lease option can work in a somewhat traditional deal. Assume you find a seller who agrees to lease option a home to you. Through negotiating with the seller, you agree to pay $1,000 down and $1,000 per month with an option to purchase the home in 2 years for $220,000. Then you go to your buyer's list and find a tenant buyer who is willing to pay $4,000 down, $1,300 a month, and an option price of $250,000. If you run the numbers, you'll see that in this deal you will make $3,000 from the down payment, $300 per month rent, and an additional $27,000 when the tenant buyer exercises their option. This is a simple sandwich where you are in the middle of the overall transaction just like the meat in a sandwich. But can this same strategy be applied in other markets? Of course it can, and here's how. Expensive homes. One of the biggest questions facing an investor in an area where homes are priced in the $400,000 to $700,000 range is how can you sandwich lease option them when the rental market won't support the rent required to turn a monthly profit? Because if you look at it, let's say you have a $500,000 home and wanted to rent it out, it would probably rent for around $2,000 to $2,500 in most markets. However, the underlying mortgage on that price home will be around $3,000 to $3,500 per month. So again, the question becomes, how can you sandwich lease option a home from a seller whose payments are significantly more than what market rent will allow? The answer lies in simply changing your mindset a little. You see, typically when you look for someone to occupy a lease option, you look for someone to rent for a while and then, ideally to move, allowing you to set up another lease option with a new tenant buyer. But in this case, you want to look strictly for buyers. That way, the current rental market becomes irrelevant. You look for someone who understands that it may take $3,500 to $4,000 a month to move into the home. Well, then of course you must ask yourself why this person doesn't simply buy the home outright and possibly save some money? Well, there are plenty of people out there who make very good money, but do not have very good credit. They want a nice house, but their lender denies them because of their credit issues. These are the buyers you are looking for when the market rent will not support an amount to cover the underlying mortgage, much less a profit. When you find these buyers, everything else runs just like normal and you are able to turn a profit for an otherwise difficult situation. Non-appreciating markets. If a particular market is flat and not experiencing any appreciation, then the question becomes, how can I buy a house at full price today and then sell it for more in a year or two if the market is not appreciating? This is actually a great question, but not one that a sandwich lease can answer. See, if a seller is selling a home for $250,000, but the market is flat, you won't be able to sell it for, say, $280,000 in a year. So, in this kind of market, you need to work backwards and use what you know about the market to negotiate with the seller. Start by calculating what you think the property will sell for in 12 to 18 months. For the sake of the example, let's assume that number remains at $250,000. Knowing that, you then go back to the seller with the idea that you need to negotiate a price of $220,000 to $230,000. Many times the seller will also know the market is flat and it will be difficult for them to get full price, but this is also where it is important to have a motivated seller. So you combine their motivation with a discussion of how flat the market is, illustrating to the seller that he may have to wait many more months to get close to his asking price, and that you are offering money now if he will just come down on the asking price a little. Once you have secured a lease option with the seller for a lower sales price, you go back to your buyer's list and find someone willing to pay enough to turn a profit, but offer them the option at around $250,000 or what fair market price should be in a year. When the numbers are tight. Now, there are some markets where buyers and sellers are looking for almost the exact same numbers. That is to say, a buyer needs at least $1,500 a month to do the deal, but the most a majority of tenant buyers can afford is also $1,500 a month. It doesn't appear there is room for profit here, or is there? Well, these kinds of deals come down to your ability to negotiate with both parties. You want both sides to feel like the deal is so close to coming to fruition that if each just gave a little bit, it could be done. Tell the seller that you just can't quite come up with enough to cover the payment they are asking for, but if they would come down just a bit, you could make it work. Then go to the tenant buyer you have lined up and tell them that if they could come up with just a little more, you can get them into the house. Go back and forth like this as much as you can and need to in order to make it so you have a monthly profit. For example, maybe you convinced the seller to come down $140 per month and you convinced the tenant buyer to come up $160 per month. By doing this, you are able to secure $300 a month for your profit. You can do something similar with the purchase price. See, you are in business to make money, so work with both tenant buyer and seller to ensure you are comfortable with your profit. If you can be a little flexible and negotiate, you will find there are more deals than you have time to do in any given area or market. An example. Jake was a fairly new investor who was very ambitious to get started. He sent out about 3,000 postcards to people who lived out of state but owned property in his city. An individual called from Texas saying that he owned a house in a fairly desirable area that was currently rented out by some less than perfect renters. He told Jake that they hadn't paid rent for 2 months and that they had trashed the home and ruined the carpets. Jake looked at the property and estimated it would be worth about $75,000 after it was fixed up, but that it needed around $5,000 in repairs. The Texas man was renting the place for $600, which was a bit low for the average market rents for the area. He told Jake that the mortgage on the property was $55,000 with payments of $550 per month. Jake offered a solution. He told the man that he would rent the property for $550 a month for 2 years, and that he would evict the tenants for free. As part of the deal, Jake also required an option to buy the home in 2 years for the current balance of $55,000. At face value, this was a great deal. However, Jake had 2 problems: uncooperative tenants and a home that needed repairs. He decided to deal with the tenants first. He knew that if you have the money, often you can bribe the tenants to leave and they will. So he went to the home planning to ask the tenants to move, but then to offer them $500 if they wouldn't agree to the move. Much to his surprise, the tenants agreed and he never had to bring up the money. Once the tenants were gone, he focused on the repairs, but Jake had a problem: he had no money. He had literally given his last $100 to the property owner to bind their agreement. Fortunately, Jake understood the power of handyman renters. He knew that he could offer the home with an option to buy in exchange for the needed work being completed. So he ran the following ad in the newspaper. Rent to own low down. You fix large house. He received over 100 calls. After sorting through his new buyers list, he chose a couple and asked them for $1,500 down and $750 a month rent with $200 credited to the purchase price of the home as rent credit. In addition, he gave them the option to purchase the home for $75,000. The tenant buyers asked if it was acceptable if they paid him $3,500 down and $575 a month rent. Obviously, Jake was okay with this, as it put more money in his pocket now as opposed to having him wait for it. These tenant buyers cleaned up the home all at their own expense. So far, Jake had only paid $100 to the seller to secure the deal and $30 for a newspaper ad. He had in his pocket $3,500 in cash and an additional $25 per month rent. However, the tenant buyers had terrible credit, which is why they liked the lease option in the first place. Over the next 6 months, Jake worked with a lender he knew to get the tenant buyers a loan to purchase the property. He said it was a little difficult and frustrating at times, but in the end they got the loan, bought the property, and he walked away with $20,000 in his pocket. Not too bad for only investing $130. There are several things you can learn from Jake's example. Don't fix houses, fix financing. In Jake's story, he never picked up a hammer, he never used a paintbrush, he didn't even spend any money to buy materials. Instead, he created desirable terms for a couple on his buyers list and helped solve their bad credit problems. In return, they fixed up the house. You do not need to own property, just control it. Owning property was the best tactic in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. Banks were handing out money to anyone who had a pulse. But now, times have changed and banks are no longer so liberal with their money. Thus, new tactics need to be applied to an ever-changing market. Even if you have a lot of cash on hand, it may eventually run out, and why risk it if you don't need to? Now you know several ways to make a good profit using sandwich lease options in a variety of scenarios. You can see that there is really no way you won't make money, even if you don't have money to spend, credit to use, or time to spend. Sandwich lease options are flexible and very profitable. To help you understand exactly how a sandwich lease option works, here is a brief outline of the process in 2 parts. The first part is your agreement with the seller. The second is your agreement with the tenant/buyer. Part 1. Find a motivated seller who is willing to enter into a lease option with you. Provide a small amount down. Most lease options require some amount to be paid up front, however, remember that everything is negotiable. Negotiate the terms of the lease. Major repairs over $500 are the owner's responsibility. Minor repairs under $500 are your responsibility. Keep in mind you are going to pass this responsibility to your tenant buyer. The lease term ends when option comes due. Make sure you know your local laws and if they control how long the lease term can be. Also keep in mind that you want your lease and option time to be longer than what you offer your tenant buyer. The lease offers you rent or credit options to be applied toward the final purchase price. An expiring lease and option can be renegotiated and renewed. The lease and option comes with the ability to sublease and assign the option. The option agreement locks in the future purchase price. The title remains in the seller's name until the option is exercised. Make sure you use 2 separate agreements, one for the lease agreement and another for the option agreement. Some homeowners may agree to reduce or even waive the initial payment in favor of higher monthly payments. You would also want to negotiate higher rent credits as well, but it can be a great option to get control of a property with nothing out of pocket. You can also try to work out a deal where you pay the initial deposit in installments payable over time. As long as you are creative and working to find what the seller needs, you can usually come up with a win-win situation for both of you. Part 2. Choose from your buyer's list someone whose needs are met by the property you have available. Collect a down payment option consideration from the tenant buyer that is higher than the down payment option consideration you paid the owner. Negotiate the terms of the lease. Major repairs over $500 are the responsibility of the homeowner. Minor repairs under $500 are the responsibility of the tenant buyer. The lease term ends when the option comes due. Again, make sure you know your local laws and abide by them. Also, make sure the lease you offer is shorter than the lease agreement you have with the owner to provide you time to exercise your option agreement with the owner. Ensure you have an established notification time for when the tenant buyer has to let you know they plan on exercising their option. For example, the tenant buyer is required to give you 2 months' notice before exercising their option to purchase. The lease offers rent or option credits to the tenant buyer. Make sure that you preserve your profit when calculating the amount of credit you will offer. An expiring lease and option can be renegotiated and renewed pending the renegotiation and renewal of the original lease and option agreement. Make sure the tenant buyer cannot sublease or assign their option to another party. The option agreement locks in a future purchase price that is higher than the purchase price in the original option agreement between you and the seller. The title remains in the seller's name until the option is exercised. Make sure you use 2 separate agreements, one for the lease agreement and another for the option agreement. Protecting your lease option. In the lease option lesson, you learned why it is important to take steps to protect your lease option, as well as several things you can do to protect it. Each of the ways to protect a regular lease option still applies to a sandwich lease option. By way of review, some of the steps mentioned are: to record your option in the public records, to escrow the deed or quitclaim deed, and to transfer the property and an explanation of each party's rights into a trust. However, there are a couple of additional steps you should take to protect both sides of a sandwich lease option. The first has to do with the fact that as a holder of a sandwich lease option, you don't have insurable interest in the property and consequently can't get insurance on the property. Therefore, you need to make sure that the property owner purchases a landlord insurance policy that covers fire, vandalism, and loss of rent. When they get this policy, you need to be listed as an additional insured on it, so you will be notified if there is a cancellation or change in the policy. That way, if the policy does get changed or canceled, you can go back to the owner to make sure they have the insurance reinstated as a means of protecting your non-insurable interest. The second step you need to take to protect a sandwich lease option is to make sure your tenant buyer has a renter's insurance policy that covers fire, vandalism, and their personal property. You also need to be listed as an additional insured on this policy to know if changes or cancellation occur to the policy. You need these insurances because in the event the home burns down or is severely vandalized, repairing it could take more than your potential profit, and if you don't have enough money to cover the repairs, it is very possible that you could be sued by either the property owner or the tenant buyer. Now, laws regarding options vary state to state, so it's a good idea to check with a local attorney to make sure you are in full compliance with all applicable regulations concerning both lease options as well as responsibility for potential damage. A third step to take to further protect your option is to set up an escrow account that will make the property owner's mortgage payment for them. See, if the owner forgets or decides to stop paying their mortgage, you could lose everything in the event of a foreclosure. Now, there is the possibility that you cover the missed payments and have that amount deducted from the final purchase price, but if you don't have those funds immediately available, or if the amount required is more than the deal is worth, you could have problems. So check into various escrow companies and see what options they have to ensure the owner's mortgage payments get made. You may even negotiate the cost of this service to be deducted from the purchase price as well, since many out-of-state property owners will be glad to have the payment made automatically for them. Disclosures. One of the popular legal trends in real estate right now is disclosures. Some states have adopted extensive disclosure requirements on leases and sales. For example, California requires a seismic hazard disclosure for certain areas, Ohio requires written property disclosures about the condition of a property upon the execution of a lease option agreement, and many states have adopted radon gas disclosures. There are even federal laws requiring disclosures. For example, even if you are not the owner of a property and are sandwich leasing it, you are required to conform to the lead-based paint disclosure. The lead-based paint disclosure requires the lessor of any rental property constructed before 1979 disclose the presence of any lead-based paint or hazards known by the lessor, and to provide the lessee with all respective reports in the lessor's possession. In addition, the lessee must be provided with an EPA pamphlet entitled Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home, as well as a 10-day period to conduct an inspection for lead-based hazards. Therefore, because of the trend to disclose so much, it is in your best interest when doing a sandwich lease option to disclose anything that would be required if the transaction was a sale. It is also a good idea to get into the habit of having your tenant buyers sign and date a document stating that they received each of the disclosures you provide them. Marketing. You should have learned quite a bit about marketing by going through several previous lessons. For example, in the cash flow buyers list lesson you were shown how to market to find tenant buyers, and in the sellers list lesson you were shown how to find sellers who are willing to enter into these kinds of deals. However, there are a few other marketing tips that you can consider for sandwich lease options. One of the best places to look for sandwich lease option opportunities is by looking at homes that are for rent. When you see a home with a for rent sign on it, consider knocking on the door and seeing if anyone is home. If not, that's fine, simply write down the number given on the sign and make a call. Either way, get hold of the landlord and make an appointment to see the property. Before you visit the property, make sure and do some homework to find out how much similar properties in the neighborhood are selling for and what they are renting for. Then, after you have visited the property, ask the owner why he is renting rather than selling. Most of the time, the owner is renting because they couldn't sell and didn't know about lease optioning. Next, ask the owner how much he would like from the sale of the home if they are interested in selling it. If they give you a price below market value for the neighborhood, then you have a good lease option candidate because you know for sure the owner is already willing to lease out the property. In this case, the owner may be willing to accept a smaller deposit and a monthly rent amount that is close to market rent. You want to try and negotiate the down and monthly amount to be as low as possible so as to provide enough room for profit when you get your tenant buyer in the property. Another great way to find lease option opportunities is to look at properties being sold by realtors. Now, you don't actually want to talk to the realtor, instead, you want to talk with the owner. When you do talk to them, simply tell them that when their contract with the realtor is over, and if the property hasn't sold, to contact you and you may have a solution for them. Explain that if they would like to sell their property within 30 days, all they have to do is give you a call in order to make the arrangements. Then just give them one of your business cards and wait for them to call. If you happen to have a good agent on your power team, ask them to log into their multiple listing service account and pull expired listings that meet your investment criteria. You could then contact the owners and present the idea of a lease option to get their home sold quickly. When you talk to the owners, you want to focus on the amount of money they would be saving by entering into a lease option with you. For example, if they were selling the home for $100,000 with a real estate agent, they would probably lose 7% in realtor commissions. So then they are down to $93,000, but then if they can't find anyone to pay full asking price, that number will go down even further. You then explain that, by doing a lease option with you, they do not have to pay the realtor fees, and you will be offering them top dollar for the property. You have also learned how to do public research to find people who may be going through eviction, divorce, family deaths, foreclosure, or other financially troubling experiences. You can contact the owners of these properties and see if they would be interested in selling the property quickly for top dollar. Other option possibilities. As you have learned, there are a lot of ways to structure a lease option and sandwich lease option to make some good money. However, not all states allow each of the steps that are most beneficial to protect you in an option scenario. Similarly, you may be in an area whose economy is not befitting lease options and sandwiches. But don't worry, there are many other variants of options you can look into to still make good money. Each of these will be discussed in greater detail in their respective lessons, but evaluate them briefly here to get an idea of other things that can be done. Option without a lease. A purchase option can be used without a lease as a means of gaining control over a property and generating profit. C. Once you have obtained an option, you can either sell, assign, the option to a third-party buyer. If evidence shows that a particular area is ripe for development, you can use an option as a long-term investment technique. With just the option, you have a low-risk investment that is cheaper than obtaining property through traditional financing, especially when dealing with markets that have an uncertain future. Sale-leaseback. Sale-leasebacks have been used by investors ever since the early 1940s. The basic idea behind the deal is you buy a property, sell it to another investor who in turn leases it back to you with the option to sublease it and an option to repurchase it in the future. To do this with nothing down, simply sign a contract to purchase the property from the seller, then another contract to sell it to an investor. By way of a double closing, you purchase the property from the seller and immediately sell it to the investor. Through your lease-sublease agreement, you then lease it to a tenant buyer who has an option to purchase it. The sale-leaseback has several legal issues that need to be dealt with very carefully. For example, if the IRS audits one of the parties in a sale-leaseback, they may characterize the transaction as an illegal disguised financial arrangement. There are several penalties for doing this, but many things that can be done to prevent it as well. Again, this technique will be explained further in its respective lesson. Contract for deed. Some states call this technique an installment land contract, an all-inclusive trust deed, or a contract for deed. Whatever the name, the idea is the same. You sign an agreement to make payments to the owner and after a period of time agree to buy the property. See, this is just slightly different than a lease option. With the lease option, you have the option to buy, but in a contract for deed, you are obligated to buy. It is just slightly more complicated and a bit more risky, but essentially functions the same as a lease option. Subject to. This kind of deal is much more difficult to obtain simply because it has to originate with the seller. See, they tell you how to buy the property instead of the other way around. Now, you may be thinking, why in the world would this be a good option for an investor? Its benefit stems from the sheer desperation on the part of the seller. It's as if they say to you, just take the house, I'll sign it over to you. It is sad to see people so desperate to get rid of a property, but it does occasionally happen and can be a huge relief to the person signing it over to you. They may have severe emotional ties to the property that they don't want to deal with any longer. They may be in such financial stress that they simply don't care to work anything out, or any number of other reasons that would cause them to simply part with the property. The transaction is fairly basic. Know the surface. The homeowner signs the property over to you, but the loan stays in their name and you simply make the payments. However, again, there are several things you need to make sure are in order to make it legitimate, and those will be discussed in the particular subject to lesson. Seller financing. This is a fantastic way to buy property that really only has two drawbacks. The seller wants a down payment, and the interest rate you pay is typically higher than average. Essentially, the technique consists of you buying a property from a seller, but the owner carries the mortgage instead of a lending institution such as a bank. One of the best things about this kind of deal is that the purchase doesn't show up on your credit report, which leaves your credit open for other investments. However, you do need to have the cash available for the down payment. There are some things to watch out for in paperwork issues to make sure you get right, but they will be covered in the seller financing lesson. Summary: sandwich lease options can be a very versatile and profitable way to get started on a good investment career. They can be manipulated to fit virtually any market and financial situation. They are easy to find and don't require a lot of money in order to make a lot of money. Anyone can do this and be very successful. So make sure you understand how to market to find properties, as well as how to find buyers and sellers. Then take the time to understand the agreements and how they need to be structured between you and the seller and you and the tenant buyer to be most beneficial and profitable for you. Then, simply go out and make it happen. You can do it, and hopefully by now you understand the financial rewards that can come by making it happen. Coming up. From here you can move on to other lessons that discuss variations of lease options as well as examples of those techniques. If you feel you need to, revisit the income property analysis lesson to get a refresher on how to evaluate properties and determine offer amounts, as well as the cash flow buyers list lesson to remind you of the best ways to create a cash flow buyers list. Again, the best parts of sandwich lease options are that you do not have to have a lot of money to make a lot of money using them, and your credit history will not come into question. As long as you have confidence in what you know, you will be able to be a success in real estate. So evaluate this technique and determine if it is a good match for you, and then go out and start making money using it.